But I mentioned to you that the president has been working to get China to give us a better deal instead of the short end of the stick in trade deals. But Joe Biden's entry into the presidential sweepstakes with a rather sizable lead over Bernie Sanders, I know it's a long way to the convention in the summer of next year. But if he gets the nomination, he apparently doesn't think China is a big deal at all, at least that they're not an economic threat to the United States. On that note, it's great to welcome back Frank Gaffney, the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. Frank, how is it that Joe Biden cannot see China as a threat to this country economically?
Well, $1.5 billion paid by the Bank of China to his family might have something to do with it. I don't know, Lars. Would they be able to buy your silence for $1.5 billion?
No, the answer to that is no. And the members of my family, I mean, for instance, I've got family members who are in various kinds of businesses. If I have a conflict, I announce it to my audience. I haven't had a conflict like that. But even if if my adult daughter or adult son went into the financial services business the way Joe Biden's son did, and even if they said, Lars, you got to stop talking bad about Canada or Iraq or something because they just put $1.5 billion in my fund and I'm making a lot of money from it, I'd say, well, you can do everything you want, but I'm going to keep on telling people what I think. I'm not going to do that. In fact, Joe Biden could do that. He could tell his son Hunter, well, you're in a business, I'm in a business. We keep the two of them separate. There should be what do they call that, Frank? A Chinese wall of separation between Daddy Joe's business as running for president and son Hunter's business as taking financial, investments from China. You say that's great. Represent your client, but I'm gonna say whatever I think is the right thing to say.
Yeah. Well, if there's any chance we could get you to run for the Democratic nomination for president, it would be a really good thing for the country.
Now, that would be fun.
Here's the thing. On top of everything else, Joe Biden presided over the transaction, as best I can tell. He brought his son with him on Air Force Two when he was going to China as Vice President of the United States. And 10 days later, after he came back, the deal was announced. So, I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, this is about rank personal corruption. And I think the extent to which it is coloring the former vice president's view of the reality that China is not only a serious problem for this country, Lars, as we have been arguing in a new effort I'm helping with called the Committee on the Present Danger, China, the reality is China has actually been at war with us under the Chinese Communist Party since, I would argue, at least 1991, maybe considerably longer. And the trouble is, much of the policy elite in Washington, Republican and Democratic, has until very recently been more or less on the same page with what Uncle Joe is saying. It's just that I think to a really quite striking degree, there seems to be an emerging consensus on both sides of the aisle, notwithstanding Joe's, dismissal of the threat, that it actually is a threat. It's a serious problem. You have Nancy Pelosi more or less on the same page as Donald Trump about the dangers that China is representing. And that's a good thing for America.
Well, and this is a concern because you know what I worry about, Frank? To some extent, we're like fish in water. The fish isn't really aware of the water. And we sit here in the United States. We've been used to being in the country that is the strongest economically, the strongest militarily, arguably the strongest diplomatically. We've got the biggest bully pulpit, and we've been there for the better part of 100 years, at least 70 years since World War II. We are the strongest, factor on the planet. And we're not used to playing number 2 or number 10 or number 12. There are countries for whom that's the reality. There are countries who realize, there are 20 countries ahead of us economically, militarily, and diplomatically. We're not used to that. what are Americans going to do if the day ever comes where we realize China calls the tune and the United States dances because we don't have any other choice? And they are big enough, 1.5 billion people, their GDP not quite, what is it, half of what ours is. I think it was a third. But someday, with that kind of economic might, that kind of size, they could arguably be bigger. And it would be American businesses and American citizens who say, what do we need to do to kowtow to China, literally kowtow to China, to say we need their business more than they need us. Right now, it's the other way around. And by the time that day arrives, it'll be too late to fix it, won't it?
Yeah, for sure. But two quick points, Lars. One is that this isn't just something that we might idly speculate could happen. That is the plan that Xi Jinping, the president for life of Communist China, is pursuing. It is explicitly aimed at displacing the United States as the dominant power in the world and compelling the United States, whether through force or through other techniques, as with the rest of the world, to conform to whatever China says is the way it's going to be. And secondly, to your specific point, what we have been doing under the Obama-Biden administration, I'm sorry to say, under the Bush-Cheney administration, under the Clinton-Gore administration, and arguably going all the way back to Nixon-Agnew, we have been essentially enabling the buildup of China, the so-called peaceful rise of China, only it turns out they didn't have any interest in a peaceful outcome to that peaceful rise except on their terms. So what we're looking at, and to your specific, again, warning, we had a meeting of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, and people can find out, we've got many videos that describe what we're talking about here in much greater detail at presentdangerchina.org. But one of them was from an old friend and colleague of mine by the name of Roger Robinson. He's actually given two briefings on this, one in New York and one in Washington in the past 2 weeks. And what he has documented is that the Chinese are now using our own capital market and those of other Western governments to raise money to support their various initiatives, whether it's building aircraft carriers or whether it's emplacing the surveillance state machinery that is oppressing the Uyghurs and Christians and Falun Gong and Tibetans and regular old-fashioned non-denominational Chinese, and that is, building the engine for the unrestricted warfare they've been waging on us, again, for decades. This is a problem because we're not only funding the enemy, selling the rope, and all that they'll hang us with.
Yep.
We're also actually, I believe, creating a lobby in America of people who have their pension funds invested with Chinese companies. That is a huge problem for the future.
Well, and having set the groundwork for this by accusing Donald Trump of having a tie to Russia, and then having the Mueller investigation saying, no, it isn't there. And all we have to say is, well, let's take a look at Hunter Biden. And if Joe Biden starts getting those questions, Frank, thanks for the work you do at the Center for Security Policy. We got to start asking that question and bug the reporters, Ask Joe Biden about his son Hunter and the ties to the Biden family in China.